And however silly or stupid various laws, regulations, and ordinances may sound, keep in mind that every single one of them is backed by threats of violence. If you disobey their arbitrary whims at first, they might just send you a warning letter, but if you disobey or ignore them, then they will eventually send you a slightly nastier letter, and then a fine, and then a more serious demand, and eventually a threat of cops showing up to arrest you to seize your property. Many red pills in this great new book, Parasites on Parade, by today's guest, Larken Rose. In fact, leave me your favorite anarchist/voluntarist comment in the sections below. And my favorite one, I'll send you out a signed copy of The Most Dangerous Superstition by Larken Rose. Larken, how are you?
Good, good.
All right, so I want to go over a few questions here, and you fill me in on what the anarchist position is on these. What is the major problem in the world, and what is the solution?
Well, the biggest problem, the biggest threat to humanity is basically the belief in authority and how it alters people's thoughts and behaviors and makes them put up with injustice and evil when it's been legislated and legalized, and they think it's okay, and they either tolerate it or they actually help carry it out if they're the enforcers. And that happens way more often than individuals being individually malicious and robbing or attacking people. That happens some, but compared to the amount of extortion and robbery and assault that happens in the name of authority, the private theft and thuggery is kind of trivial.
Sure. There was a very popular meme going around Twitter, and it said, the world anarchists want. And it was a lifeguard sitting at the top of his chair, just with his arms folded, looking up, and everyone around him is drowning. In other words, far from being a group of people who want to cooperate, do what's best for each other, the anarchist is very isolated, only caring really about themselves, not the well-being of others. How do you respond to the mindset of someone who sees that and goes, oh, that's a perfect point?
Well, it's a weird thing that people do when they're scared of the idea of not having a ruler, and it's weird to watch the hallucinations that happen in their brain of what that would mean, as if we suddenly don't care about each other and wouldn't cooperate and wouldn't organize and wouldn't help each other and would, like, what does that say about the person who thinks that they think that if not for politicians and tax collectors and bureaucrats, they must think that about themselves, or maybe they just think everybody else is horrible scum except for laws and regulations. It's ridiculous. Like decent people know that politicians are not the reason they're decent. It's not the reason they care about other people. And removing a bunch of political parasites doesn't suddenly make us care about each other less. It just takes a giant parasite off of us and, frees up way more wealth and time and energy to actually voluntarily cooperate and help each other and stuff.
Here is another mindset that I'm interested in getting into. My friend, loosely using the word friend here, sends me a joke, and he says, Ayn Rand, Paul Ryan, and Rand Paul walk into a bar, and then they all die of alcohol poisoning because there's no regulations. How do you respond to that mindset?
Again, it's a perfect example of how people, because they haven't seen a stateless society, they have all these weird random fears about what it might be, because people are so driven by fear of the unknown. The idea that people who sell products wouldn't care about killing their customers, like, I don't care how greedy and nasty some evil businessman is, if you kill your customers, you don't make a profit very long. And the idea that the customers wouldn't bother having anything where they review stuff or check things out, which already happens. You can already go online and have normal people saying what they think about a product and whatever. So again, it's this weird notion that nanny state is the only reason any of us care about what's safe or would hurt each other. And it's just ridiculous. It's just fear-based, imaginary hallucinations.
Why do you believe, or why do you say morality is objective rather than subjective?
That can be a very long discussion. I'll try to make it the short version. which is basically, if you look at the amount of overlap that most people have, like most decent, unless they're sociopaths, most decent people realize it's not okay to like beat somebody up and take their stuff and be nasty to people. Like, it's an instinctive thing built into us. It isn't just, well, today I decided to not be nasty to you. Like, it's built into, and whether people want to argue about, well, it's built into our genetics as a survival trait to be cooperative or something, like whatever. I don't usually care enough to argue with people about why it is that way. But the fact that there is so much overlap in so many people about how we think we should treat other people, including all around the world and cultures, and there are usually big exceptions when it comes to the belief in authority, that, well, if you go against the authority, then it can stomp on you and do whatever it wants. But other than that, almost every culture teaches you don't steal other people's stuff, you don't attack them, you don't lie about them, you don't do whatever. And so to me, it almost, I don't talk about it all that often because it almost doesn't matter to me whether somebody thinks it's objective or subjective, as long as they understand you shouldn't attack people. You shouldn't be the aggressor, which most people understand. But I think ultimately, if your position doesn't include morality as an actual thing, whatever you think it comes from and whatever you think the explanation is, it's a little bit scary, because then you're sort of somebody who, if tomorrow you think your own interests are served by killing your neighbor and stealing his stuff, what's going to stop you from doing it? Unless something inside you says, I shouldn't do that. And that something is, whether you want to call it conscience or anything else, that's what I refer to as direct access to right and wrong. Like, we have built into us a general understanding of what human beings are supposed to be and what they're not supposed to be. Which is why when we hear about some serial killer cannibal, we all go, "Ooh, that's not what we're supposed to be." Like, no kidding.
Well, it's amazing how people become, statists will become like total moral objectivists with regards to like other regimes and other times in history. This was wrong unambiguously. But then today they're like, well, we live in a society. Society has rules. It's like, why didn't you just apply that to Kim Jong-il or Pol Pot or the ATF? What was it, like 25 years ago today? Today is the Waco anniversary. That's just shocking to me, to see that.
Yeah, well, and they do that because the current ruling class is the one they were trained to believe has the moral right to rule them. They weren't trained to believe that Hitler has the right to rule them, or Mao or Pol Pot or whatever. So they can look at those other ones and say, yeah, the people who disobeyed were the good guys, and that was illegitimate. But this one is real and legitimate because I was raised to think you have to obey their laws and pay tribute to them by way of tax. So it's just a matter of an indoctrination. It isn't, logically, there's no freaking difference between saying, they didn't have an obligation to obey those laws, and we don't have an obligation to obey these laws. We have an obligation to do the right thing. But a lot of people they think there's a difference because they were successfully indoctrinated into believing that this one is legitimate and real, and you have to bow to it and obey.
Let's say you can send a message to Ben Shapiro and Meghan McCain. Over the last week, Meghan McCain said, I hope Julian Assange rots in hell for colluding with Chelsea Manning to expose collateral murder. Ben Shapiro refers to him on Joe Rogan's show as a criminal worthy of going to jail and whatnot. How would you communicate to someone like that who sees the Julian Assange arrest and says, finally, some justice around here?
Well, people in that particular situation where their outspoken statist authoritarian garbage is what they are, it's the basis of their income and the basis of their career and their reputation and everything about them, they have a gigantic psychological wall in the way of them ever reconsidering anything. So that's a tough one to try to break through that. Especially if I have like one message to tell them. I guess the message would be in the form of a question, like Candles in the Dark. I'd say, what government injustice, what atrocity, what nasty things going on behind the scenes do you think an insider should illegally expose? And where do you draw the line? Like, if they find out there's actual like mass murder and terrorism going on And do you think, no, the good thing is to keep your mouth shut and cover it up and be, complacent and accomplice to it? Is there any point? And then have them start thinking, well, yeah, I guess at some point you have to break the law and squeal. But yeah, getting those people to think about that. Good luck.
Well, speaking of exposing authoritarians, I just remembered, if you want to check out my interview with a Waco survivor, I interviewed David Thibodeau not too long ago. I will put the link in this description below. So
Wow.
Michael Sandel, a Harvard professor, says the libertarian, the voluntarist, focuses too much on consent, and this sort of gives him a narrow, inhumane view of the world in and of itself, using a real-world example of an elderly woman who agrees to a plumber to fix a small leak for $50,000. She, clearly being uninformed at whatever, maybe she had an illness. The judge, in other words, struck it down and said, you can't charge her $50,000 for something that costs $500. Is this a shortcoming in the non-aggression principle outlook on the world that only consent matters?
Not really, because and this actually comes up in when people argue about like age of consent relating to sexual things and stuff. Because when there isn't informed consent, the person isn't of a mental capacity to actually know what they're doing. And I use the example of if there's some baby that like inherited a gold coin and like, and somebody says, I have a candy bar, I want to trade this for your gold coin. I would forcibly intervene and said, no, you don't get to do that trade, because the baby has no idea what they're giving up. And so if it's basically it's fraud and deception to do a voluntary trade in which one side really has no idea what just happened and no idea what's going on. And so that isn't real consent. You can't give consent if you don't actually know what's going on. So to use that as an example, and again, the implication is, so never mind consent. Like, what? How does that make anything better? So yeah, okay, now we're just going to violently rob the little old lady of $50,000 because heck with the consent thing. It's just an example of it isn't really consent if the person doesn't know what they're consenting to.
Now, the statists will often look at the world and say, cars are very dangerous. Electricity in your house is so dangerous. Start fires, electrocute people to death. Therefore, cars, guns, electric licensing is therefore necessary. How do you respond to someone who says, if we did not have a state enforcing licensing for things that are so dangerous, that the world would kind of be not total Mad Max chaos, but so many bad things would happen that from a utilitarian standpoint, you just have to recognize the legitimacy of licensing in order for us to live happy, safe, fulfilling lives?
Well, it's still such an immature view. It's basically saying we're not fit to like decide for ourselves what we want to do. We need, big daddy or big mommy government taking care of us. And the thing is, there are already plenty of examples of, Consumer Reports and UL listing and of private organizations that their job is to look at something and see if it's safe. And the example of like building inspectors, if somebody's building a house and wants to make sure like there aren't problems, it's not going to burst into flames or fall over or something, they have an incentive to go ask somebody who knows what they're doing, like, is this going to be safe? The idea that we don't have any self-preservation incentive without government is just so insulting to humanity. It's basically saying we're all stupid children. On the other hand, it does allow people a degree of freedom in which they can decide how much they care about somebody. If somebody wants to build a rickety shack and have candles in it, okay, you can. And it might fall over or blow over, it might burst into flames. The idea that you get to violently dominate somebody else for their own good and for their own safety, you can see how ridiculous that gets now with all the labels on everything that, do not use this toaster in your bathtub. Like the mentality that we need government telling us what's safe and what isn't, instead of understanding reality is inherently unsafe. There's lots of ways you can hurt yourself. You get to decide which of those things you're going to do. It's called freedom. Freedom necessarily includes risk. And if you're trying to reduce all risk, you're literally going to reduce all freedom. Like, if you want complete security in slavery, go volunteer yourself into a prison. sell, because they'll make sure that nothing electrocutes you and catches on fire. If you want that for yourself, go for it. Don't tell other people they have to do that.
One thing that I think is a bit of a fallacy that we run into is people will share the quote attributed to Franklin: you can either have freedom or security, but if you choose security, you won't have freedom, or something like that. I just butchered that, I'm sorry. But the idea that isn't necessarily true. Let's say you give the state a ton of power. When do really powerful states make people safe? Like, aren't they psycho-genocidal, property-stealing, mass murdering organizations? Like, the alternative to I'm afraid of risk isn't give a group of people a monopoly on violence and recognize their legitimacy. It's incredible that people will say, I'm afraid of bad things happening, so let's give all the power to Trump and Obama and Bush and Clinton. Like, how do you come to that conclusion?
Yeah, it's not even a trade-off between freedom or security. And I think the Ben Franklin quote is actually, it includes the like either temporary or imaginary security, like giving away essential freedoms in exchange for either imaginary security or temporary security, because government promises of security, like, will protect you from, whatever crime or terrorism or invaders or drugs or whatever else. They're always empty promises. It's not like there's actually a choice between we have freedom and let these bad things happen, or we have government stop the bad things. The choice is we have freedom and the possibility that an occasional bad thing is going to happen, because that's reality, or we have government that promises security and then makes everything way worse and way more bad things happen, and we don't have freedom. Those are the actual choices.
All right, so I am a statist who looks at public lands and can greatly appreciate their beauty. I look at publicly funded arts and I say, gosh, this is terrific. And my main fear is, in the absence of a state, the masses will sort of embrace a commercialism that will sort of make us less humane. It will make things less significant. Instead of appreciating Notre Dame, there will be a McDonald's in place of it. How do you communicate to the statist that says, for the betterment of our intellect and the prospering of a social order, we can't allow freedom because people will embrace commercialism and the less finer things in life?
It's difficult to explain to people how much even commercialism would look different in a free society, because right now, with government controls and playing with corporations and doing that things, it skews the thing. So it's nothing like a free market, but people sort of think it's free market. But the most important thing to understand, and this is one it's uncomfortable for people, including for me for that matter, is I don't get to decide what's done with the rest of the world, because it's not mine. And so for example, if there's some big woods somewhere that's not mine, that my own preference is, I hope that stays woods, and so I can walk in it or whatever. Other people want houses, and they want houses made of wood, so they want to cut down some of the trees there to make a house out of it. The idea that one person should get to decide what is done with the rest of the world that isn't there is way more dangerous than the sort of annoying possibility of, yeah, other people are going to do things with other stuff that I kind of wish they didn't, whether it's natural resources or somebody's not going to pay for art or whatever. Like, I don't get to decide everybody else's choices for them, but the lure of government is always about control. It's always about telling people everyone else will be stupid and irrational and irresponsible and dangerous if you don't let us, the ruling class, control them. And that's not at all actually true, but you do have to give up the illusion of control to have an actually free society. You don't get to decide what's done with every acre of natural wilderness in the world, because it's not yours. You do get to take places and keep them and say, I'm going to leave this as it is, and get together with other people and do that sort of thing. But as soon as we're running off to government to say, hey, government, tell the rest of the world what they can do with the rest of the world, you're going to make more problems than solutions by a long shot.
John Rawls, the Harvard philosopher, says the arbitrariness of the world must be corrected, and this is what justifies coercive state intervention. For example, you might have someone born by pure luck in the geographical area of the Hamptons in America, that person's going to have a very easy life. Whereas some people in Haiti, Guatemala, Nigeria, those places those people are born at a total disadvantage. They also don't have skills that other people are born with, not because those people worked hard, but by accidents of guilt, by accidents of chance. And in other words, these are totally arbitrary. They're not the result of hard work. Therefore, the state is totally justified in redistributing them because they're not yours. You didn't work for them. How do you respond to that mindset?
The idea that, first of all, reality isn't fair. Like, you might be born missing a leg or whatever else, or you might be born in a really poor area or a dangerous area, or you might be born in a rich area like you're talking about. Like, that isn't fair. Like, it's true. The notion that adding violence to the equation is going to make things better or fair is ridiculous. So it's basically like the premise, if you follow through and are honest about it, it's like, well, that person happened to be born into on a continent where most of the people are pretty dang rich. Like, I was born in the US, which is pretty dang rich compared to most of the world. And this person over here born in India or Nepal or China or Africa or whatever, they're not so bored. So we better go to Larken and point a gun in his face and say, hand over a certain amount of your stuff. It's like, wait a minute. How did my luck, my blind luck, accident of birth, turn into a reason to initiate violence against me? Like, that is pretty much the worst solution you could have. Now, a perfectly good free market, or I don't even know if you call it market, but a free solution is the people who have tons of stuff give to the people who don't, which already happens with billions and billions of dollars worth of stuff, locally and internationally and everything between. And the thing is, the less government there is, the more prosperous society is. And the more prosperous society is, the more we can give to the less fortunate and not even notice. Like, now in the US, people just give other people a car and stuff, which is just unheard of wealth for most of the world. And for a lot of Americans, it's like, well, I have this old car, you can have it. Like, that's what happens when you have enough prosperity, enough freedom to create that much prosperity. Whereas if you try to approach it as, let's go use violence against all the people who, by the blind luck of birth have an advantage, like, all you're doing is tearing everything down to the worst level by way of violence. It doesn't lift anybody up. It just makes conflict and injustice.
I spoke with someone yesterday, and after a really long conversation, they just ended it by saying, look, I just want fairness. I want everyone to play by the same rules, and I want people to have the same opportunity. Now, how would you communicate the message to that person who just sort of has that outlook? Like, regardless of left, right, voluntarism, and whatnot, if they just have that mindset, I want fairness, equality of opportunity, and people to play by the same rules. How do you communicate to that mindset?
Well, the first obvious response to me would be, well, me too. I don't want there to be a category of people that has societal permission to violently rob the rest of us. That's not exactly fairness and equality. I want morality applied the same to everybody. I don't get to rob you. You don't get to rob me. The people who call themselves government don't get to rob either one of us. And the biggest obstacle to opportunity around the world is government. And you can see that now if you just try to, like, build an addition on your house, like Parasites on Parade was about. You get these giant tentacles of the state, even at a local level, interfering with everything. Whereas in an actually free society, it would be so easy for, like, if I had nothing, I knew nobody and had no money, but it was actually a free society where I could just say, all right, I'm going to work a little bit for a little bit of money, just doing some manual labor. I'm going to wander off into the woods it isn't claimed, nobody's using it, whatever. I'm going to build a little shack. I'm going to work, do this. I'm going to trade stuff. Like, it's really easy to start from ground zero and do something. If you try to do that in the US, it's impossible. You're not allowed to live in a shack in the woods because we have zoning codes and blah, 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 blah. You're not allowed to live in a place that costs less than however many tens of thousands of dollars at least. You have to have this kind of plumbing. You have to have electricity. So they hack all the lower rungs off of the ladder, so there's no starting point. Like, if you took 1 million people from Nepal, like one of the poorest countries in the world, and plunked them in the woods in the US, they would probably do just fine until government found out they were there and said, you're not allowed to harvest this, you're not allowed to build your own that, you're not allowed to be living there, you're not allowed to do this, because the natural resources in a lot of the world are abundant. Our ability to use them is interfered with first and foremost by government making it not fair and making there not be opportunities.
Now, using the candles in the dark methods, by the way, I went in Phoenix. It's incredible. If another one comes around, you got to go because these things are terrific. How do you speak to, I want to first go progressives, then conservatives, then minarchists. How do you communicate the candles in the dark differently regarding progressives?
Well, it's all about tailoring the questions to what they already believe in and the goodness in them, the things. It's not about, I'm going to talk you into having my moral code. It's about finding the parts of their moral code that are already good and decent, and they're about peaceful coexistence. And that's true in everybody, no matter how like vehemently frothing at the mouth political they may be. So progressives, for example, it's like you care about the poor, right? Like you want the downtrodden or whatever helped out, right? Now, if you could have government, have a situation in which government doesn't force you to pay for war, for example, would you prefer that? Like, don't make me pay for war, and now I'll have more money to help the people I want to help. And all of them will say, yeah, I don't want to pay for the war. Okay, good. I agree. I want you to have that too. And then sort of go down the line and like, well, would you do that with everything in the government so you could decide what things of the government you actually want to support and what things you don't? And then would you extend that to me? And so for every category, it's finding the part of them that wants voluntary cooperation and organization, because that's what most people want. They run to government when they want force use because they've been trained to think that that's okay. But like every single, and one of the most fundamental things is every political category or any category of people, they have a list of things that the government does that they really, really don't like. And so when you pose it as, well, if authority tells you, you have to do this, like you're in a day and age where authority tells you you're not allowed to hire black people or something. Do you think you have a moral obligation to obey that law, or would you break that law? And of course, progressives say, no, I'd ignore that law all over the place. I'll do whatever I want. That's horrible. That's evil. I totally agree. In that case, you should absolutely disregard the law, lie to the law enforcers, do whatever you can to ignore authority and disobey it. Absolutely do that. And then get them to the point of considering, well, all right, where do I draw the line? Because if I'm only, because, so sort of to jump to the end, it usually ends up as, well, then does that mean you think it's up to you to decide what laws you have to obey and what laws you don't? And suddenly they get uncomfortable because they crash into their own indoctrination of, is that what I think? That is the only rational thing for anybody to think is, of course, at the end of the day, my conscience is what matters, not scribbles of politicians. If they tell me to do something evil, heck with them, I don't care. So it's just, it determines the starting point, like where their politics starts from, which examples they're more likely to say, like, in that case, heck with authority, I'm going to break the law.
All right. Well, that actually answers all three, which is why I love interviewing Larken. He just takes them down so many at a time. Okay. Owning property you don't use. Is someone morally justified in owning something, say, renting out a house, owning a place, and then just letting people sort of work there and rent it out? In other words, is this a just way of acquiring wealth? I don't know if you would call it necessarily what makes capitalism. In fact, no, it's not what makes capitalism unique. But as far as, is it morally justified to own a large portion of land, even if you don't work there, if you're not constantly visiting there? Is that a morally just way of acquiring wealth in a free society?
If you got it voluntarily, yeah. Now, a lot of the people who are huge landowners now, it got to them by way of government showing up and saying, we own this half a continent and now we'll sell pieces of it. And so it wasn't legitimately acquired to begin with, which sort of makes the situation confusing and a mess. And in actually free society, you don't just get a bazillion acres by saying, this is all mine, like the homesteading principle applies, where if you go and you build something or you farm something or you harvest something, you go and make use of the nature, then it becomes yours. There isn't like a magical limit that you own 3 houses, now you're evil. It's just whether it was acquired voluntarily or by fraud or coercion. That's the distinction that matters. And the people who complain, like, there are people who say rent is theft, which is just ridiculous. Like, if I build a house with my own 2 hands, in fact, this is actually a situation. If I build a house with my own 2 hands and somebody says, can I live there if I give you a few bucks? In what way am I oppressing them? In what way do they or anybody else own what I built? The fact that my butt isn't in that building at the moment has nothing to do with whether it's mine. It's as ridiculous as saying, well, you drove to the store and got out of your car and you were in the store for 30 minutes, so I took your car because you weren't in it. Like, it's still my freaking car. It doesn't magically turn into somebody else's because I wasn't in it for 5 seconds. What matters is how it came into my possession and ownership. Was it through voluntary interaction? And if so, it's not, by definition, it's not oppressing anybody else for me to have created or acquired something through voluntary means. If I stole the car from you, then it's not mine. You have the right to come take it back. If I bought it from somebody selling cars, you don't have the right to steal it. Like it's not that complicated until people try to make up these weird collectivist excuses for stealing stuff from other people.
Christopher Hitchens, in an attempt to defend Fabian socialism, says it's important that we don't have a society that in order to take care of the poor, we're basically dependent on the whim of the rich. Will they donate? Will I starve? This sort of keeps people in this sort of limbo of not living fulfilled lives, of constantly being nervous. Therefore, a social safety net, including Medicare and Social Security, are then justified through the mechanism of a state. How do you respond to that mindset?
Well, first, notice that they never literally describe what they advocate. Social safety net doesn't mean anything. It's this weird, bizarre euphemism for nothing. What they actually mean is we need violent redistribution of wealth. We need the state threatening violence against lots of people to help the less fortunate. The fact that they never phrase it that way shows that they are, from the beginning, intellectually dishonest. Now, some of them are intellectually dishonest even with themselves. Like, they don't even think that far. They just think free stuff from government. But so they can be totally clueless. But somebody like Hitchens, he understands that it's by violence, and the fact that he doesn't say it and he doesn't describe it that way. Because why don't you say, well, I don't want the poor depending on the generosity of the rich, so we need men with guns to go to the poor and go to the rich and take some of their money. Like, if he honestly said it that way, everybody would cringe because everybody would see how evil it is. So instead, he refers to it as a safety net. But the notion, it's one of those things where people look at a problem caused by authoritarianism and they blame freedom for it. Like, people are like, well, I need a job or I'll starve to death. Well, why can't you go in the woods and hunt and gather yourself? Because of government. It's not because some corporation is trying to sell you some soda. Like, you don't have to buy their stuff and you don't have to work for them. So the limits on what people can do that are a result of authoritarianism, authoritarians use that as an excuse for more authoritarianism, because they say, well, I'd starve if these big evil corporations don't give me a job, which is A, nowhere near true, and B, the only reason there's any truth to it is because of authoritarian restrictions on what we're allowed to do. So it's basically saying, it's like putting everybody in a prison and saying, well, now they're going to starve to death if we don't go rob somebody to give them free food. Well, how about don't put them in a prison to begin with?
So Tucker Carlson was on Ben Shapiro's show, and he said, look, freedom, I get that there's good intentions behind it, but unfortunately, a good thing is people innovate when they're free. The bad thing is it leads to very negative outcomes sometimes. For example, artificial intelligence stealing jobs. Of course, taxation isn't theft, but innovation is theft. how do you respond to someone who sees such massive amounts of innovation coming? They're so they really are in fear that the norms of their life, the way they currently earn income, that those are threatened by such a thing, and therefore things like outlawing innovation, things like universal basic income, are therefore justified. How do you speak to that scarcity mindset?
Well, again, if you just ask them to be clear about what they're actually saying and where they would draw the line, it quickly becomes ridiculous. Like, look at all the people who would be out there, running around with rickshaws, pulling people around, if not for cars. So obviously, we need the violence of the state to tell people you're not allowed to have cars anymore, because look at all the jobs that you put out of business by inventing cars. Or, all the people who shoe the horses, they're out of job because everybody uses cars now. And as soon as you put them in the seat of victim, like, Tucker Carlson or whoever the heck you're talking to, and say, well, look around you at the stuff you have that was made by machines and that makes it so you don't have to hire somebody else to do stuff. Like, okay, first thing, we're taking away your washing machine and your dryer, because it used to be people had to do that. And you're being evil and nasty and greedy for putting those people out of a job. You get to lose your car, heck with your electricity and your running water, and pretty much everything of convenience you have replaces what somebody else might have been paid to do. And of course, when you put it that way, they go, well, no, what I have is fine. The conveniences I have are fine. But some vague notion of somebody out there, like, we shouldn't have them lose their job. No, you should have a voluntary society, and a voluntary society means that jobs that are no longer actually of value to the people because something better came along have to turn into something else. And to try to fight that is basically trying to keep us as cavemen. Like, well, no, any progress is going to make something have to change, and we can't have anything change. It's like, you don't have a right to trade with somebody else. If they find somebody, and another example I'd use is like this new store came along and they have better product or better service at a lower price. That's an outrage. What's going to happen to the people who do a crappy product for a really bad price? They're going to go out of business, and they should, because that's what the market does, and it's what freedom does. It improves all of society, and the people who lose out are the ones who are not producing enough value to their fellow human beings. And the idea that we should use violence to make sure to reward people who are not producing as much value as somebody else is as ridiculous as you can get.
Now, the neoconservative and leftists sort of come together on this next one. They say, look, the state is morally justified in case in point of the Second World War, where you have evil such as Mussolini, Hitler, you have the Japanese Empire. Therefore, a state is justified because you have to counter other states, those ones being illegitimate, ours being necessary to stop such inherent immorality. So how does the anarchist respond to, of course, a government's justified, or else we'd have the Nazi rule all over the planet?
Well, my canned response to that particular example is, hooray, the U.S. military spent $1 gazillion in stolen funds and got a bunch of people killed in order to defeat the third worst mass murder in history, and then give half of Europe to the second worst mass murder in history, Joseph Stalin. Like, you can't, by any stretch of the imagination, pretend that the outcome of that was freedom and justice for all. It built the Soviet Union. It built the big thing that we were supposed to be scared of for decades and decades. But beyond that particular example is the insane notion that if A is good or necessary, then violently robbing people for it is justified. And the example I'd use for that is, well, it's pretty necessary that you have food because you die without food. So therefore, I'm going to go rob some people at gunpoint to buy you some food and give it to you. And you can't possibly have any moral objection to that because the outcome is so important. It's so important that you have food so you don't die that you must be okay with me robbing people. And the notion that, well, defense against blah, 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 In a free society, for example, I think defense against actual tyrants would be amazingly cost effective. It would basically be raise a bake sale to hire an assassin to kill the guy at the top. And you'll notice that governments do the exact opposite. They say, we'll kill millions and millions of your pawns, but we, the tyrants at the top, won't target each other. We'll just sit back and every once in a while we'll have a meeting and say loud words at each other, and then we'll send our pawns to murder each other. In a free society, if somebody says, we're going to invade and take your stuff, well, will somebody knock that guy off? And then we do, and you don't have to kill millions of pawns on either side. And so the idea that there's no such thing as defense without giant military monstrosities, which, the US monstrosity goes around the world starting fights everywhere. There's no one for it to defend against. It's a ridiculous joke. But even conceptually, the idea that you need mass extortion in a standing army or we'd be defenseless, once again, it's ridiculous. And it's based on people's fear of the unknown, because they don't grasp how things really work. And the politicians keep telling them, if not for us having tons of power, you'd be oppressed and murdered and wandered.
So say that you're talking to someone who is a minority in a society, and they fear that they will be discriminated against amongst the majority. Therefore, what we need is a state to coerce people, unfortunately, into making sure they don't discriminate against said minorities. For example, you had quite a great deal of discrimination throughout American history amongst blacks, women mistreated. So, and then of course there was the draft, which never gets mentioned as obvious slavery because it doesn't fit the cultural Marxist agenda. But if I fear discrimination and say without a state coercing me, the majority at any time could stop giving me their services, and I could totally be discriminated against and almost starve to death. How does the anarchist deal with such a claim?
Well, again, there's the philosophical and then there's the historical examples, both of which show how ridiculous that is. First of all, just logically, if you're in the minority, if you're thinking that a government that gets voted into power is the way to protect you from the majority that can outvote you, that's a really bad approach. And if you look at it historically, you see the outcome. What happened to slaves who ran away? They were chased down by government agents. That's what the government did, because the government that was, the legislation came from elected representatives elected by the majority, said that no, these people are the property of those people. And if somebody tries to help them escape, that's a crime. Or if they try to run away themselves, that's a crime. And we're going to send our enforcers to enforce the injustice. Picture a free society. Let's say there's somebody evil and loony enough to actually think he can own other human beings. So he has this plantation and he has, 30, 50 slaves there that he's trying to enslave and oppress. And lots of other people think that's totally bogus. We have the right to do whatever it takes to free them, and they have the right to do whatever it takes to get away. There isn't this giant overarching authoritarian monstrosity enforcing his claimed ownership of those people. There's just him, which means 5 minutes later, if he's even still alive, he has 0 slaves. Whereas if you have a giant democratically elected constitutional Republican form of government enforcing the evil, you're kind of doomed. And you see the same thing with forced segregation and then forced integration in the other direction. Like at every stage, government was throwing violence into the equation instead of letting people just do freedom of association. Hey, if you own your house or your school and you're a bigoted doofus who only wants white people there, you get to decide who can be on your property, and the rest of everybody else gets to say, well, you're an idiot. And somebody else over here says, well, I want people of any color and any background to be in my property or my school or whatever. Let people do the freedom of association thing, and you wouldn't have had any of the violence in any direction that you had in this country. Instead, you have government saying, we will make the decision for everybody and force it on everybody. And that made all of the injustices way worse and last way longer. Let the individual racist butthead be an exclusive bigoted twerp on his own property. Who on earth would want to be there anyway? Like, if you're black, you really want to hang out on the property of some racist dumbass? Let him be a dumbass on his own property. Don't make there be a government that he and his fellow dumbasses can go to and enforce his dumbassery on the rest of the population. Let him do his thing on his property. Let people who are less stupid do their thing on their own property. And none of the rest of the problems even happen or matter.
So Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon are two outspoken feminists, and they say things such as pornography and prostitution, while you might not physically see a gun pointed to someone's head, what they do is they create a culture of violence. They demean people, in this case women, as objects, thus making them more likely for violence to succumb to them. So while you might not see something as directly violence, what it does is it belittles the humanity of someone else, and therefore prostitution and pornography should be illegal. So while they're not technically pointing a gun, in the same way if I rile up a bunch of people and say, hey, let's go murder those guys, even if I never touch a gun, I am creating an environment in which I know violence is likely to occur. Therefore, pornography and prostitution should be outlawed, along with drugs, obviously. How do you respond to the Andrea Dworkins and Catherine McKinnons of the world? Both PhDs, by the way.
If you literally break it down to just the logical thing of what they're advocating, you realize it isn't at all logical. It's utterly stupid. Because it's one thing to say, these things may tend to cause this attitude, which may tend to cause violence. Even if you're totally right about that, and that there are patterns and there's reasons to not do that. You can say about pornography, you can say it about video games, you can theorize about whatever you want. Whether you're right or not, the solution of government prohibition is ridiculous, because what you're actually saying is a woman who decides for whatever reason to become a prostitute may, because of the cultural implications or what that implies to people, end up being a victim of violence. Therefore, we need taking that woman and putting her in a cage. Like, we need to guarantee violence in order to compete against possible theoretical violence in the future. Like, again, when you realize that the government solution is always the initiation of violence, it's always stupid. It's always counterproductive. It's like, the memes that are out there, like, don't use drugs because it'll ruin your life. So we caught you with a little bit of weed and threw you in a cage for 10 years because that's going to help your life out tons. So even though their concerns may be valid, like, yeah, this isn't that good for society. Like, I don't think prostitution is good for society spiritually or whatever you want to call it. But it's nowhere near as bad as let's initiate violence against all the people involved. That's just utterly ridiculous. And so the problem, again, the problem is their belief in authority, because they see a problem and they think that, well, if government uses violence, it doesn't count. So if we can see anything where we don't really like how this turns out, it's not fair, or it might have an effect that's this, or it may cause people to think the wrong way or act the wrong way later, let's have government violence. Like, they're advocating the problem because it's called legislation. They're advocating the actual problem, which is violence, under the guise of fighting some theoretical possible future violence, which is just ridiculous. It's like saying, prostitution may, tend to, or pornography or both, may tend to cause people to have viewpoints that blah, 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 blah. So we better just kill everybody involved. Like, if you said that, everybody would go, what? No, don't do that. But they're saying only a slightly less stupid version, which is we better threaten violence and cage everybody involved, because otherwise some of it may tend to lead people to be violent. How about you go after the people who are actually violent and use defensive force to stop them, instead of using this, violence ahead of time on the wild guess that if you don't, somebody might be violent otherwise. Is ridiculous.
And Jonah Goldberg has an argument against drug legalization, saying that, in short, when using drugs, you strip yourself of your rational faculties. This makes you not free to use drugs in the way I should be free to read any book I want. That doesn't turn me into somewhat of an animal, whereas heroin, crack, crystal meth, crocodile, those things make you almost inhuman. Therefore, we're not stripping away your freedom. We're stopping you from enslaving yourself by giving you the virtuous drug war. How do you respond to the kind and virtuous Jonah Goldberg?
Stopping you from enslaving yourself by threatening to cage you. Once again, if you just literally describe it, you see how insane it is. And again, it's a fine example where I think drug addiction is a serious problem for a lot of people. It's really bad for people. And never in a million years would I say, well, obviously the solution is for me to point a gun in their face and put them in a cage. Like, why would anybody think that's the solution? But if you believe in government, that's the solution everybody jumps to. And what they, in the statist mindset, they assume that if you don't want the government solution, you must not think the problem is a problem, which is equally stupid. It's the whole there ought to be a law mentality. And if you don't think there ought to be a law, you must think there's nothing wrong with it. No, I just think that adding lots of violence is not the way to solve actual problems in society. So again, it's just a stupid authoritarian shortcut of, I see something wrong and they're seeing something that's actually wrong. We better solve this by government violence. No, that's about the only way you could make the problem worse, is by adding a bunch of government violence to it. Like drug addiction, the thing that made it worse, it made more addiction, it made the drugs less safe, it made all of the drug-related violence and gang warfare, is the war on drugs, is bringing government into it to try to solve the problem with drugs, and literally made it 1,000 times worse than it was to begin with.
What is the voluntarist or anarchist response to children's rights? In other words, I fear that children not being able to fend for themselves, think, whether they can't think for themselves or physically stick up for themselves. Therefore, the state acting on behalf of children, sort of as a steward or a representative, is therefore necessary, because in the absence of a state, you would kind of have everyone for themselves. You don't know if children are going to be hurt, raped, malnourished, not taken care of. Is this a shortcoming in the voluntarist point of view?
It's another cop-out, because again, it's identifying a real problem and deciding authoritarian power is the answer. In a situation like that, like, it's really hard to tell, like, if I'm just me, never mind 911 and the cops and government, and I know my neighbor is like violently abusing their children, there is some point at which I would feel justified by myself forcibly intervening. Like, if you're beating your kids to death, I'm going to come stop you. I'm going to come onto your property without your permission, and I'm going to stop you. And it makes for an uncomfortable gray area. Like, well, if they're all the way like murdering their kids, of course I'm going to intervene. What about if they're loud and drunk and occasionally smack their kids? All right, what am I going to do then? I'm probably not going to blaze in with a machine gun, but I may try to talk to them or talk to other people. And like, what do we do about this? This is not okay. And so the reason so many people are statists is because it gives them an out from all of the uncomfortable things of a free, uncertain society, because then they don't have to do anything. Then it's just, we'll tell the authorities about it. So again, there's the assumption in their position is, in a free society, nobody would do anything about it, which is why we need government. That's not at all true. I would do something about it. And if I asked them, well, would you really, if you knew your neighbors were beating your kids to death and there wasn't a government, would you just do nothing? Are you that big and irresponsible coward? Because I'm not. Most of the people I know aren't. It would be uncomfortable, and we'd have to decide, oh man, what are we going to do? And at what point do we intervene, and how do we intervene and stuff? But most people want to be the little children in the classroom that can go, teacher, can you handle this? Because we don't know what to do. But the outcome of that is horrendous, because and this is a perfect example, because the notion of protecting the children, if you look at what CPS in states do, they're all the way kidnappers. They're just evil, control freak psychos. And every once in a while, they're control freak psychos dealing with other control freak psychos, like genuinely violent, abusive parents. But to point to that as, this is why we need government to do it, ignores how often government intervenes when there wasn't actually a problem, and makes it a horrible problem. And the kids will be, you know, sexually abused or sold into slavery, all sorts of evil shit, as soon as you let government be involved. So that it's not that there's an easy, simple outcome to every problem in the world. It's that looking to government will always make the problem worse. Whereas sometimes we as just adult human beings have to figure out how to deal with the problem. All right, this, you know, my neighbor's beating up on his kids. We have to do something to make that stop. What are we going to do? It's not electing somebody. It's not calling for the authorities. It's acting as grown-ups and deciding, what are we going to do? At what point do we have to act? And it is uncomfortable, but it's way less uncomfortable than the results of letting government deal with what grown-ups should be dealing with.
One of the things I learned when I was researching for my Waco interview with David Thibodeau was that Janet Reno's justification for going ahead with the raid and selling it to Bill Clinton to give the FBI the stamp of approval was that babies were being beaten on the inside, which reminds you of 2 years earlier, them having the babies in incubators to lie us into the Gulf War, the Nyaria testimony obviously fabricated, and the World War I lie of babies on bayonets, so justifying the British entering the war. It's like they so often use the children as pawns. It's just incredible, and then they don't even think it through. Babies were being beaten, so we went in with tanks, tear gassed them, knowing it would start a fire, as it did historically in such raids. It's like, how is this never thought through? Like, if any other organization did that under the guise of keeping the children safe, we would never buy it. But just saying, I care about the children, therefore state violence, just gets people to enter this blind spot of not thinking about the outcomes.
I would say it's one step worse. They did think it through. It was just a propaganda excuse. They didn't give a crap about torturing and incinerating a bunch of little children and little old ladies and everybody in between. That was the excuse they gave to the public to get away with just an outright atrocity and mass murder. They knew it was going to happen. Like, it's like a lot of people said, like, government didn't go wrong. It's exactly what it was designed to be. It just wasn't what it's sold to us as. And they always do that. And that's what's so disgustingly evil about government, is they will always exploit people's goodness and virtue. Like, they're concerned about the children. Like, we need to do something because we're just concerned about the children. And then they commit torture and mass murder, like you know, firing the CS gas, and they're literally torturing little kids to death. I can't even talk about that.
Well, what I meant was when the public says, I care about the children, therefore government, that's what I was saying. The FBI, I actually think, definitely did that on purpose. It was really important to show that anyone who resists the state, when their initial raid is because of rumors about illegal guns, which they could have arrested Koresh for, when he was hanging out with ATF informants, shooting with them the day prior, but they had to cover up for Ruby Ridge and killing Randy Weaver's wife. So they were going to walk out with the kids one by one saying, you know, you people might want to take away our funding, but look at the children we're here to save. So so that stunt goes wrong. And then once they've been resisted, they're like, oh my God, what do we do? You guys got to check out that interview, because David and I go through his book and the Showtime 6-part series that was made about it. Okay, moving on, because that can get us down a hole here. Let's say I really care about freedom, and that is why I support government. In other words, in the absence of a state, I fear that monopolies will take over. The rich will get richer, using their power to gain even more power, and it will sort of restrict my ability as a person, as a consumer, as an employee, to seek employment, to buy things that I like, for me to become an entrepreneur myself. Does the possibility of monopolies in business or oligopolies justify the existence of a state?
It's another thing where people, just fearing the unknown and not really understanding how things work, they look at a problem that is caused by government, and then they think government is the solution. Like, I'll often just say, and I can't even count how many times this has happened, like when people say, big scary corporations would take over if not for government. I say, all right, describe for me. Here we are in a stateless society. Government's gone. Their enforcers are gone. There's this big corporation We'll pretend they're still there and they still have all their money and resources. Tell me how Pepsi Cola is going to oppress me. Tell me how they're going to force. I mean, literally describe what they're going to do to me if I don't buy their soda, which I don't. What happens now? Because they have this vague notion that they'll just be big and scary and powerful. What would that power look like? How would they have power over anything other than their own property and products? And if you don't buy it, they can't do anything. Do you think they're going to have SWAT teams going to people's houses? You didn't buy enough Pepsi? Like, people don't even think it through enough to realize there wouldn't be the mechanism of control and power if you don't have government there. Right now, what corporations, the nasty bastard corporations, do to control us, they do by way of government violence. And every once in a while, somebody will say, well, they'll hire an army. And it shows that you just don't understand economics. Like, the notion that hiring an army to go extort people is a cost-effective way to make a good profit is ridiculous, especially when 100 million of your intended targets have guns. It's much better to make something they want to buy, and you can make billions of dollars off of voluntarily selling something to a bunch of voluntary customers. So the notion that evil corporations would be able to do anything to us without government power there for them to use is ridiculous, which is why none of them can ever explain or describe, well, what would they do to me if there's not a government? What is Pepsi going to do to me if I don't buy their soda? Nothing, which means they have no power.
Let's say you are just driving through the desert, getting from point A to point B. There's a huge, long 1,000-mile desert. You're driving through and your car breaks down. You come across one guy in the middle of the desert that has a water fountain, and he says, this as my property, I'm not going to give it to you. I'm not going to sell it to you. Nothing you say will change my mind. Are you justified in attacking that man to drink the water to save your life? Does this invalidate the non-aggression principle?
There's a couple points about this. One is that when somebody concocts a really weird scenario like that, or you're crawling across the desert and there's one guy with a bottle of water for 100 miles and he says, I'll sell it to you for $500 or something. The first thing is most people will choose, to stay alive, even if it means stealing from other people. That doesn't mean, A, that it's like moral and principled and justified. It just means at the end of the day, you're going to do what you're going to do. But B, the implication is never mind consent and nonviolence, because I can think of a really weird scenario in which you might, and a silly example I use is there's some diabolical mastermind with his finger on a button that'll blow up the whole world. And he says, if you slap that little old lady who didn't do anything, I won't press it. Do you slap the little old lady and save the world? Yes, I slapped the little old lady and saved the world. It doesn't mean that, so heck with consent and nonviolence, let's just do whatever the hell we want and murder and eat each other because I would slap the little old lady to save the world. Like, it's this weird concocted thing of like, I can think of this really bizarre exception where you would violate the principle because the alternative is so outrageous. And so it does, the notion that you can come up with something that, well, in that case, you would go outside your principles, and then as if you can't even do anything to undo it. Like, if I was gonna die otherwise, I'm probably gonna use your water fountain. I might even give you some money or even agree that, yeah, I did it without your permission. So, now that I'm not dead, I'll try to do something to make it up to you. But this weird notion, and they never state the in-between, but the weird notion is that if I can find any weird concocted scenario in which you would do something outside of what you would usually do, then none of the principles ever matter in any situation. Like, what? Why? How did you get from A to B? But they'll try to do that. It's like, okay, if you're ever wandering through the desert and there's one guy with a bottle of water and you just take it and drink, or there's some house and nobody's home, would you trespass and use their water? Trespass, use their water, and try to make up for it. That doesn't mean just, okay, now you might as well violently attack anybody at any time for any reason. Whatever.
Now, how do you communicate to people who don't even grant you the premise that government is synonymous with initiating violence? How do you, when they're not even at the same starting point as you, how do you talk to that person at all?
Well, there's a lot of people who are like that just because they've never thought it through enough. And it's this weird schizo thing. I've talked about it before, how they understand something and they don't understand it at the same time. And it's really bizarre because if you walk them through the questions of, like, they say, well, taxation isn't violence. Okay, what happens if you don't pay? Let's say you get a property tax bill and you don't pay it, and you ask them what happens. Well, you get a letter, and then what happens? Well, they do this, and then they threaten to send the sheriff, and then they take the deed to your house, and they, and then they have the deed to the house, and then they send sheriffs with guns to tell you to get out because it's not your house. Like, it's weird because almost everybody knows these things. If you ask them what happens, what happens, what happens, they know at the end of the day, men with guns are going to come do nasty things to you. But part of their brain likes to think of it in terms of taxes as the price we all pay for blah, blah, blah. It's like they're trying not to know something that they totally know. And if you ask the right questions, they sort of stuck having to admit, well, yeah, ultimately they'll use violence against you if you don't pay.
So let's say I look out in the world and I see billionaires and I see people who are malnourished. To heck with your non-aggression principle. By any means necessary, I am going to feed the malnourished people. The billionaire won't even know the money's taken. Same for the millionaire. The 1%. We're going to take their money in general and give it to people who are so needy. This isn't, I want a book, so I'm taking it from Larken. This is, I have so much wealth, I'll never know if it's missing, versus if I don't have said wealth, I'm going to starve to death. How does the voluntarist respond to such a claim?
Well, there's two sides to that. One is that, like, what somebody would feel justified doing themselves, even if I think they're wrong, is just sort of, it's what they think and what they would do. And I would say, okay, if you would do that, at least it makes sense for you to hire somebody else to do it or ask somebody else to do it. Like, at least it's consistent. It may be immoral, it may be unprincipled, I may say it's wrong anyway, but at least it's consistent. But when you say, like, I can think of a scenario in which I would take his money to give to the poor, so we better have government robbing 100 million people, when I don't know the situation of any of them. Like, that's a flying leap. So there's sort of the two sides are sort of, in what scenario would they feel justified in? Well, I'm going to steal this from the billionaire who won't even know the difference. It's like, okay, that's still theft and it's still immoral if you ask me. But it's like, if that's what you would do, then that's what you would do. But the notion that you should therefore throw all principles out the window, or you can delegate rights you don't have. Like, well, now I get to delegate to government the power to rob everybody for whatever arbitrary thing I might think I want. It's still like, if we just got it down to where people advocated what they themselves would feel morally justified in doing, the world would be way, way better. If occasionally somebody might try to steal something from a billionaire to give to the poor, okay, I think that's wrong. I think they shouldn't, but it would be pretty dang rare. It would also be pretty dang unnecessary because of how prosperous the whole, world would be. But that threat to society is pretty dang puny. It's still wrong. It's still a threat, but pretty dang puny compared to what government does by people who make up excuses for government extortion.
Let's say I could care less about any of your nonsensical philosophical principles. I just believe they're hurdles to stop me from really helping the poor, which is all I care about. I just want to help those in need. You're going to point out my inconsistencies, but I don't care. I'm going to have to do whatever I do in order to help the poor and make sure that they don't starve. A little different than the previous scenario of a specific example, but what about the mindset of someone who just says, if I can help the poor with freedom, let's go there. If I could help it with fascism, socialism, communism, I'll use that method. How do you communicate to someone who is only focused on, let's say, just the poor or just the security of the nation state? As Vox Day said, yeah, communism might be bad, but at least Russia is still Russia. In free America, our nation's not even secure.
Well, if somebody's all the way to the ends justify the means, and most people aren't, like they sort of, they'll use it to some degree, but not all the way. Like if I say, well, if you just blow my head off right now and take money from me and feed the poor, would that be okay with you? Would you feel perfectly, justified in doing that? And they'll go, wow, I wouldn't do that. Okay. So there are some limits, I hope. But even if there are all the way no limits, then you get to the practical side of things. If there are all the way no limits and your goal is to help the poor, the main thing you should do is fight government. The government that says, you're not allowed to live in a little house we just built. We're going to set cops to go steal the tiny houses that people build. You're not allowed to give to the poor. I have a friend in Dallas, Texas, who him and a bunch of his buddies go out with AR-15s strapped on their backs and illegally feed the homeless, which is against the law. Other people have gotten in trouble for it. Suspiciously, the cops haven't messed with them, because imagine how weird that would look. But if somebody is actually like, ends justify the means, we got to help the poor, government is your primary enemy. They're the main thing in the way of people helping the poor. So if somebody's going to say, heck with principles, well, good, make government your enemy first and foremost, because they're the ones who say, you can't help the poor. You can't build these little houses for them to live in. Restaurants and supermarkets aren't allowed to give away food if it's past the expiration date, even though it's still perfectly good. It's against the law for them to give away tons of free food that they have. And all these stupid regulatory restrictions that are keeping people poor and homeless, and all the zoning garbage about where you're allowed to live, and you can't camp out in these woods where nobody is because government says it's their property. Like, if you're just going to look at the practical side, government is still the thing keeping people poor.
Sam Harris, in his case against freedom, says that in a state of total freedom where Larken and I make an exchange, let's say I'm creating something in a factory and then I sell it to you. If that factory permits a pollutant or a smoke that negatively affects others, what they're experiencing is an externality they didn't consent to. They have to bear the cost of something when they didn't even do anything. You and I are just making this. Is this what justifies is this what makes a state necessary, the existence of externalities when party C has to bear the cost when A and B make an exchange?
No, because it's still a cop-out. It's still saying, here's the possibility of a problem or even an existing problem. Let's get government initiating violence against everybody. And I've used the example before of, okay, there's you're living on your property and you have these woods and there's a stream running through it. Upstream, there's a factory, and now they're dumping green, weird sludge in your stream and killing the fish and making it so you can't drink the water. That is a property infringement. That's like, this is my property and now sludge is running across it instead of water. I have to do something about it. And again, if you ask people, well, what would you feel morally justified in doing? Like, this is obviously a trespass. They're doing something with a direct effect on your property. Like, it's one thing if you go into their factory and get sick, don't go into their factory. But if they send it to your property, you have the right to do something to make that stop. And so, again, it's one of those situations where people would have to think, well, at what level? Like, how about if I determine there's a little tiny bit of something in the water from the factory upstream? It's not killing everything. It's not making it undrinkable. Like, at some point, you have to decide this is bad enough that we have to do something to make them stop. And then what do you do? And going through the process of, adults thinking, well, what do we actually do about this? We maybe start by talking to them and saying, you're pouring crap in our stream. That's not okay. See if we can talk it out. If they say, we don't care, we're going to do it anyway, maybe get nastier. Maybe go to the public and do a boycott. But eventually, if you're dumping sludge into the thing that keeps me alive, I'm going to come make you stop one way or the other. And what people want government for is a get out of responsibility free card, where I don't have to do anything, just have government do it. And so in any scenario where you say, well, what about in this situation where somebody gets victimized or harmed? Don't we need government for that? It's always saying, well, if there is some scenario in which people can be negligent or malicious or stupid and harm other people, don't we need an authoritarian ruling class with permission to initiate violence against all of us? No, we still don't. There is zero situation in which giving somebody permission to initiate violence is necessary or good. Like, there are situations where defensively we might have to use force, but that's not the same thing as having government.
I had a really interestingly worded question posed to me the other day in the midst of a debate. The guy goes, he crosses his arms and gives me this look like he totally has me, like I've got you cornered. Are you ready for this? And he goes, what guarantee is there in the absence of a state that me, my family, and my property will be protected? Larken, what is the voluntarist response to that mindset, more so than the specific line of questioning?
Right, because the answer to the question is none, just like there is now. There is no guarantee you won't be victimized. With government or without government, there is no guarantee that someone won't do something nasty to you. The idea that the existence of an authoritarian ruling class can give such a guarantee, or even come close to giving such a guarantee, is ridiculous. But it's the people who have a central master plan who pretend to have a way to make such promises that you know, the immature love that, because like, well, government has this plan to make sure that I'm not going to be homeless or not have health care or be attacked by crazy drug addicts or whatever it is. So the promise of security from government is always a false promise. They never keep that promise. But people want the illusion of predictability and control and guarantees when there is no such thing. And it's so easy to come up with examples that show how ridiculous it is. You know, here I am on my property. What guarantee is it that without government, I guarantee 100% if there is a government, you are going to pay tribute to it every year or it will take your house. I guarantee it. In the absence of government, somebody might do that, but it isn't 100%. It's not even 1%. But with government, it will be 100%. You will pay property taxes or they will take your house. So using the biggest thief in the world as the thing to protect you, to guarantee that you're protected from thieves, is just ridiculous.
So let's take the if you don't pay your property taxes, we will initiate violence against you. If you resist, we are going to kill you. Let's take that and say that that's what makes it immoral. It's basically pay us or you'll die. The freedom example, in a world without a state, you could have many scenarios in which people work or they die. Therefore, there is no difference between being free and either working or dying or paying taxes. And if you don't pay them, you'll die. Either way, you're being coerced by man or by nature. Therefore, government is not far from this overburdening, tyrannical thing you voluntarists just can't appreciate. It actually is more there to assist us and is no different than the coercion we all suffer by nature.
Yeah, it's a commie approach to say, well, if I don't work, I die. And so I give the example of, let's say you're in the middle of the woods somewhere, or you're on an island by yourself, and you're going to starve to death if you don't do anything. Who is it that's oppressing you? Who is it that you have the right to initiate violence against in order to survive when there's nobody there? And in that case, they have to say, well, there's nobody there. Okay, now let's say you're in the woods and you're trying to struggle, you're struggling to survive, and I show up and I'm in the woods and I'm struggling to survive. Do you have the right to rob me? Like, I'm just there in the same dang position. Do you have the right to violently rob me for your survival? And do I have the right to violently rob you for your survival? And how well do you think that's going to go, if that's what we think? And so the notion that you can compare reality requiring work, like, because shelters don't build themselves and food does grow itself, but it doesn't harvest itself. Animals don't hunt themselves. So work is required to have anything, including just survival. But when you make it personal and specific, like, okay, so reality has made it so you have to work. Who do you get to initiate violence against to make up for the fact that reality makes it so you have to work? Because it's going to be against somebody else who has to work too. Like, is it me? Am I the one that you get to rob because the nature of the universe is such that you need food to survive? Like, if that's going to be your excuse, then I could just blow your head off and steal your stuff. And according to you, it would be perfectly justified because, hey, I need to survive. Like, is that really how you want people thinking and behaving?
A philosopher likes to, John Rawls likes to differentiate between choice and necessity. In other words, Larkin, you can choose to do this interview. You can choose to speak at Anarchadelphia coming soon, but there are some things that some people just have to do in order to get by, whether it's taking a job at a sweatshop, or even prostituting themselves, as we spoke of earlier. Is there an important difference in the philosophy of consent between choosing to do something and doing something out of pure necessity?
Well, the concepts of necessity and need are so vague and non-specific most of the time. And the commies love to do the thing of, I'm entitled to whatever I need, to each according to his need. It's like, well, what the hell does that mean? Like, I need healthcare. No, you don't. I need air conditioning. No, you don't. Most of the world lived without it. And so the whole necessity, like I have to, what that almost always means is it would be pretty dang inconvenient for me to find another way. It isn't actually a necessity. It isn't actually a need. Like you can say, all right, if I'm 50 feet under the water, I kind of need to get up to air or I die. Okay, that's an actual need. It's a need with an in order to. I need this in order to that. I need air in order to breathe, in order to stay alive. But when people say, I need a job, they're not saying anything. What they're saying is, it would be easy and convenient if somebody gave me a job as opposed to me trying to survive on my own in the woods. But they try to use fake necessities and needs to justify real violence by saying that, well, this is why it's okay for government to force this, because I have to have this. And ultimately, what you need is a cardboard box and some cabbage. Like, that's what you actually need. If you want anything beyond that, don't pretend it's a need or a necessity. And even those are just, you need it in order to live. But the number of things that statists and collectivists say, well, we need this, we need that. And of course, it's always people who don't need that stuff. It's people who are richer than most of the world who are complaining about, we have to have government because we need this and that and the other things. Really? Why aren't you focused on giving away what you have to the billion people in India or the billion in Africa or the billion in China who have way less than you do? Why is the focus always on you need what the people richer than you have instead of the people poorer than you need what you have? So it's always a dishonest spin. It's always trying to make an excuse to justify extortion, usually by way of government.
Say you are speaking to the group Doctors Against Circumcision. They see this as a barbaric form, unnecessary genital mutilation, a violation of the non-aggression principle causing severe harm. Therefore, the only response to do this, we can't go around to each individual person and really help convince them. So therefore, either we have a law or we embrace this evil, barbaric thing, circumcision, just as an example of something widely accepted today that I see as totally immoral and agree with the doctors on. How do you respond to someone who says, I see this terrible evil, I just want to pass a law? What's wrong with passing a law to stop someone from violating this principle of non-aggression?
I think circumcision is just heinously evil too, completely unnecessary and stupid. It's a perfect example of just a cultural tradition that's just totally screwed up, but people do it because that's just what we do, and we never think about stuff. And I think it's, when Americans talk about, female genital mutilation on the other side of the world, like that's heinous and horrible, they're right. And then they suddenly apply a completely different standard to the genital mutilation that most of America is just fine with. But it's a fine example to use that even in a situation where, like, if I had a way to stop people from doing that to babies, I would. If you're going to government asking it to do something that you would feel justified in doing yourself, at least that's consistent. The thing is, nobody who wants government only wants it to do things that they would have the right in doing themselves. Like, for example, if I knew somebody was, being violently attacked somewhere and I couldn't get there for whatever reason, I wouldn't have a moral objection to calling the cops to go stop the person. Like, because using violence to stop the attacker is justified. Now, the fact that the cop is paid with stolen money and half the time he's robbing innocent people, I'm not his buddy. I don't like him. He shouldn't exist. The government shouldn't exist. And if there's anybody in the neighborhood I know with a gun who isn't a cop, I'd call them first. But basically it's sort of like it's a tool of violence. And if somebody uses a tool of violence in a situation where violence is justified, I don't even mind that. The thing is, government is never only a tool of defensive force. It is always an aggressor as well. So I compare it, it's hardly even an analogy. If there's some violent thug in my neighborhood who, you know, beats the crap out of people and steals their stuff and violently attacks people, but I know, you know, a friend of mine is being assaulted, and I call up the thug and say, I'll give you $50 to come save my friend. I'm not opposed to doing that, even though I think the thug is a piece of crap and immoral, and, you know, I would try to stop him from almost everything else he does. It's still, if right now you could use defensive force, I could convince you to use defensive force, then I would. The thing is, nobody who's a statist only wants government to use defensive force. And you don't need government, you don't need badges, and you don't need authority to use defensive force. You just need the ability to use force. So when people use it as an excuse for, that's why we need government, no, that's why we need somebody to be able to use defensive force to protect the person who's being attacked. But deciding we need an aggressor to defend makes no sense. Like, it's saying we need someone to be a violent, heartless thug in the neighborhood who beats up everybody, so we have a violent thug to call if we need protection. Well, he doesn't need to be an aggressor to do that. And you don't need to be government to be a group of people who will actually protect the innocent from aggressors.
I remember one of my first like in class conversations when it was like sort of me versus the teacher. I think I was in like sophomore year of high school, and I said, look, the Affordable Care Act, Obamacare, I get what you're going at. You want to get people a lot of things, but I don't believe in initiating force. It's like that's what makes this ACA thing bad. It was the first time I'd ever considered force being involved with government. And I said, so yeah, that's why I'm not in support of it. And the teacher gives me like this so confused look, like he didn't know where he was. He just entered a black hole, and he goes, so you let them die? And I go, and I said, well, no. And it was the first time I was thinking of this stuff, so I didn't have a good rebuttal. I was like George Costanza with the jerk store thing. I thought about it years later. So you go over this in a chapter called When in Doubt, Advocate Violence. This speaks to the mindset of, do we do nothing or do we pass a law? How do you communicate to those people?
Yeah, the notion, again, it's when they're looking at government versus the unknown. So many people just go, well, I don't quite know how it would be, so we have to have government. And the idea that not having, especially when it's this particular piece of legislation that only came into existence a few years ago. We weren't all dying in the streets before it existed. So the idea that, oh, you just want everybody to die if you don't like that is already ridiculous, because we already have real world example, namely most of our lives, to show that no, it doesn't mean you all die. But that's so much the game that politicians play, where they can scare you with a hypothetical what if, even if it has no resemblance to reality. And people will say, well, just in case, we'd better allow them to do this authoritarian thing. And in the case of Obama's commie care, it got so ridiculous. And it's, you know, because it's literally saying, oh, look at all these people who don't have insurance. We're going to make you go buy insurance by pointing a gun at you. It's like, oh, look at all these people who don't have big mansions. We're going to make you go buy mansions, and then you'll have to thank us for pointing a gun at you and making you buy something you didn't have before. And then we get credit for you having what you paid for. Like the level of violence that it's gotten to and how overt it is, and still have people cheering for it, is just ridiculous. Like to literally have a situation where people are concerned, not enough people have insurance. I know, we'll force them to go buy insurance. How can anybody be fooled by that? But people are so scared of the unknown that people will fall for that and think it would be chaos if we didn't have government pointing guns at us, making us buy something we maybe don't want and maybe can't afford.
I was in the break room of my work speaking with an older woman, and she goes, what we really need is Medicare for all. And I go, all right, before getting into the morals of it, I go, you're on Medicare. Are you happy with it? She goes, oh God, no, I hate it so much. That's why I picked up this job. And this job is actually really nice because they give me nice health benefits. And that's how I really get things. And I go, so you're advocating something you don't even like yourself, but for everyone. She goes, well, no, that's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is equality. What matters is that we as a group, as a collective, get equal care, and not one is raised above the other, creating sort of an arbitrary hierarchy. So even if it's universally lousy, at least it's equal. To which I responded, so North Korea is a more moral society than the US because there's more equality? To which she goes, yeah, I think so. So when you talk to someone like that, who even when you push them on the implications of their beliefs, will pretty much go all the way to Kim Jong-un legitimizing, how do you speak to that mindset?
Well, the first suggestion, which is sort of hysterical given what statists always do, is say, well, go to North Korea. Like, I don't know if they let you in, but if you told them how much you admire their system, they might. Like, or you can at least go to China or something. There's half communist, half capitalist. But again, it's so much, they think that whatever imaginary utopia they can hallucinate justifies government trying to do it. They don't even care about the fact that every time government is promised a utopia, they never deliver. They deliver a giant disaster instead. So people will, and I've seen a number of people do the equivalent of this, where they're point at what government has done and say, well, that's horrible and horrendous, but we need government to do this. And so even the big push for hysterically weird and also scary to me, there are a bunch of people who say government is corrupt and evil and doing all these horrible, nasty things. We need it to control all wealth and then give us each what it decides we deserve, because that's what socialism is. And it's like, how can you even think those two things at the same time? That it's a bunch of crooked, power happy psychos that don't care about you, and you want to give them control of everything and decide who should have what. Why would you think that's going to end well? And it's just a matter of, well, they hallucinate this commie utopia and they hope that they can vote that into existence. And you can't. Even if it was moral, you couldn't.
So one shortcoming with freedom, says a fellow YouTuber who I'm not even going to plug his stuff. He goes, a shortcoming with embracing just a totally freedom ideology is that you get people who forget subjectivity, who make objectively wrong decisions, using a real world example of there being an atrocity, that there was a hurricane, which people were malnourished and everything, and there was a helicopter, and the guy was going to this place where there were people in need. He brought the news organization instead of the nurses. The nurses would have saved lives. The news just wanted to put it on there. The reason he chose news is because they gave him more money. In the absence of a state, this sort of corruption is almost inevitable to happen. How can you justify a system in which people would rather bring news organizations to places where people are in need rather than nurses?
Two things immediately jump to mind. First of all, that happened in the presence of government, not in the absence of one. And there are so many times people go, look at this horrible thing that happened. This is why we need government. Like, we have government and it happened. I had somebody tell me, and I almost fell out of my chair. It would say, if not for government, things like 9/11 would happen. 9/11 did happen because of government. Like, but aside from that, there's always, again, they want to wish into existence their ideal scenario, and they ignore the fact that government always does the opposite. Like, they ignore the fact that in the Louisiana floods, government was actively using threats of violence to keep private people from coming in and bringing supplies and helping people. They actually kept them out. There were boatloads of food and supplies and help for free. The government said, you're not allowed in, we're in control here. That's the real world example of government authoritarian control. So when people say, well, we think this would happen without government, and they ignore what actually really does happen with government, like the way they don't just do a crappy job of helping people in emergency situations, they get in the way of people helping each other to a ridiculous degree. But people still think, well, if I can imagine some utopian government solution, then maybe I can vote it into existence. And no, you can't.
So, by the way, did you ever see Dianne Feinstein in the wake of the Louisiana Katrina, where she said, "If I could have passed the legislation, Mr. or Mrs. America, turn in your guns, I would have done it."
Yeah, yeah, I saw her say that, and it's so weird how so many people want to pretend that that isn't their final goal of disarming the people, or deny the fact that the reason they want to disarm the people is because they want unarmed subjects. It has nothing to do with crime, and they know it has nothing to do with crime. But every once in a while, they're accidentally that honest about it. Although it's happening more and more, where they're openly about stealing guns and being psychos. So, yeehaw! I guess that's a good thing. It's just sort of sad that more people aren't. What did you just say?
So another shortcoming with the non-state position is we could get Mises, mumps, rubella. I think that's how we could get the MMR sickness spread in the absence of a state mandating vaccines. Therefore, in order for public health at large and children who would suffer because their parents are unappreciative of the benefits of vaccine, these terrible things could happen. Does this justify the existence of a state and mandatory vaccines, for example?
Once again, government thrives off of theoretical disasters that they say, if we don't do this, if we don't have authoritarian power, these are the horrible things that happen. And it's always theoretical. And the list is just endless. And they're constantly adding to the list. If not for this, we'd all be. And the measles is one of the most ridiculous things that people are now trying to be scared of measles, if not for vaccinations everywhere. When I was growing up, it's just a thing that almost everybody gets. And then you have an immunity, and who cares? And so if they can scare people enough to want to condone like forced vaccinations and stuff based on that, or based on just totally made up scenarios that this scary thing will happen if we don't do it, it's always a mythical unknown and the promise that government authoritarian control will prevent it, that dupes people into going for authoritarian control, even though it doesn't prevent it. It doesn't fix it anyway. But if you can do that, there isn't a limit. You could say, well, aliens are going to invade and take us all over unless you give us unlimited control of power. Like, well, what argument is it that other than you're just making up something to be scared of?
Two really popular tweets by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Andrew Yang have gotten a lot of attention. There were basically a bunch of people chanting AOC sucks, to which she responds, whatever, I still want to give them health care. Before you answer that, Andrew Yang then says, I've gone from just being a guy who wants to give people money to being a serious presidential candidate who wants to give people money in the form of universal basic income. I get that we've sort of touched on this earlier, but those are two really unique examples of people just saying, I just want to give people something. What's wrong with giving? How do you respond?
It's sad that American people are so stupid that they actually fall for it. Like, it used to be that you had to hide the message under more layers, because the fact that there's anybody who doesn't respond to, wait, giving whose money? Like, mine? Because I sort of like the choice of where my money gets given. Like, that most people don't even think enough to think it's not their money. They don't have it. Like, if either of them had $12 trillion and wanted to give it away, fine, go right ahead. And you don't need to be elected to do that. You only need to be elected if you're trying to give away my stuff. And the fact that they can be that openly dishonest about it, and most people still don't notice, oh, they just want to give us free stuff. No, they want to take your stuff and give it to other people and get credit for being generous. And it's sad that people fall for it when it's that blatantly stupid. Although it's also sad that people fall for it when it's as blatantly stupid as what Trump has said. So apparently the hurdle for how sophisticated you have to be to dupe people into cheering for authoritarianism is pretty dang low now. Like, you can just be openly, I'm going to give you free a couple $1,000s a month. Yay, I'll vote for you. Just really, that's where we are. That's as dumb as the American people have gotten. Oh, well.
Yeah, turns out take the guns first, due process second, Trump. Turns out that guy was not as kind and principled as we all thought he was. There was a discussion, well, without getting into the specifics. Let's say you and I, right now, I come to your house and I say, Larken, I like this place. I'm not going to leave. In fact, I'm going to walk around and I'm going to take some of your stuff. What happens today, fortunately, we have a government. So you would call them and then they would come to remove me, and the violence would be on the correct side against me and for you. Now, in the absence of that government, how do we decide what? You come to take my shirt, I want to shoot you because you're coming to take it? How do we know who owns what? Who makes these decisions? How do you respond to someone who asks that line of questioning?
Well, there's on the one hand, there's sort of guessing wrong at the motivation of most people. The idea, because government loves the idea that we're all just violent animals if not for legislation keeping us in line. So, for example, you're not going to do that to me. You in particular, I know you wouldn't. There may be some people who would. Incidentally, I still wouldn't call the cops. I'd go to my gun safe. So the one side is the idea that we're all just violent criminals waiting to happen if not for government. The other side is, and none of us would defend ourselves or organize to defend against the nasty crooks if not for government. And they're both hugely wrong. Most people don't try to attack and steal. And in the absence of government, most people would still want to defend against that. Whether it's somebody who just has a gun or somebody who has the phone number of a guy he knows who has a gun, who says, somebody's breaking into my house, can you come help me? And that has been the case since, way before government had its tentacles all over the place. People already did that, and they already worked together for protection and stuff. So again, it's sort of trying to attribute to government virtues and abilities that the people don't have. Like, they're the only ones who really care if we get robbed. They're the only ones who have the resources to make it so that people can stop us from getting robbed. And I can point out a scenario as simple as, well, let's take your local cop or whoever you would call now to save you. Never mind the fact that day after day he's robbing you. Never mind the fact that it'll probably take a half hour to show up and it won't do any good anyway. Never mind the fact that he might show up and accidentally shoot you, which has happened. Like, let's pretend he's actually going to show up and stop the criminal. The only difference between that and a free society is you hire the same guy voluntarily. He has the same rights. He shows up at your house, does the same thing. And when he isn't doing that, he's also not robbing you and all your neighbors. Like, the person would still be there. The motivation would still be there. Your motivation for protection would still be there. His motivation for being paid to protect you would still be there. All your neighbors having a motivation to be protected from this kind of person would still be there. The idea that none of us would care or do anything about it without government is as stupid as saying, well, if government doesn't control food production and distribution, we'd all sit around starving, wishing somebody was making food. No, we'd make food like we already do. It's already the people. It's not the friggin' politicians that grow the food. And so the notion that we're all just helpless children, wouldn't do anything if not for government in any scenario is just ridiculous.
Now, when the rubber hits the road, asks the statist, the non-aggression principle comes at heads with the well-being of humanity. In other words, you have this principle, it's in your head, this is what you want the world to be. But in reality, we see so many people go without basic services. If we don't have things in place that the government gives us, we would not have things such as, well, I don't want to repeat another question, but this seems to be a unique mentality among someone who says, when the rubber hits the road, do you care more about the non-aggression principle and that's what you focus on? Why instead do you focus on that rather than what historically has helped humanity? In other words, state intervention has occurred because it's been necessary for humanity to flourish, whether it's helping the poor, helping the elderly, stopping foreign invaders. When there's so much thrown at you, when someone says that, how do you respond?
Well, there's the foundation of that notion is collectivism, the idea that individual rights should matter less. What's good for the common, the collective, the whatever you want to call it, society in general, that's what should matter, not the individual rights. Those should be sacrificed, and sometimes we need aggression and stuff. Stalin and Mao and Hitler and Pol Pot and Lenin and this long list of nasty, murderous tyrants who have done horrendous things, they all voice the same thing, which is we should sacrifice the rights of the individual for the collective. The truth of the matter is if you want the closest thing to what the collectivists describe as their utopia, have absolute individual freedom and property rights, which leads to so much prosperity that we just share it so much because we don't care, and nobody's starving to death. Like in the US, nobody is starving to death, and nobody would without government welfare either, because we're so dang rich. We're nowhere near free, but there's been enough freedom that we've created so much prosperity that the idea of working really hard to stay alive isn't a thing here anymore. It's a thing in a lot of the world still, and for a lot of history, it was a thing for most of the people on the planet, is you have to work really hard to not die of starvation. That is not true in the US because of the prosperity that came from freedom, not from government. But again, it's an imaginary thing. They imagine we'd all be starving if not for government, and it's a total lie. It was never true. The freedom, the relative freedom, is why none of us starve to death here anymore. Because that much wealth was created by voluntary trade, not by the freaking government.
What, if anything, would it take for you to change your position on voluntarism or anarchism?
A lobotomy.
What is...
Because I figured out that government can't be legitimate. To me, it's not even a choice of, it's not a practical choice of one or the other. It's not like, will this work better than that? It was accidentally figuring out there's no situation in which government can be legitimate. So it's not even an option. It's like figuring out there isn't a Santa Claus. There isn't such thing as authority. We shouldn't pretend otherwise. So unless I literally get brain damage, that's not going to change.
What is the most important thing you learned from reading the works of Frederick Douglass?
The extent to which a human being can be trained not just to put up with horrendous injustice, but to not recognize it as horrendous injustice. When a lot of slaves can all the way be trained to the point where they think slavery is legitimate and just and righteous, that's really scary. And that shows the danger of mind control and just how indoctrinated a human being can be, that they actually fear and hate the idea of being free and feel all warm and fuzzy about the idea of literally being a slave.
What is the most important thing you learned from reading the works of Lysander Spooner?
Well, he did such an awesome job. I may not have learned it from him because I may have already known it by then, but he did such an awesome job of just meticulously demolishing the entire notion of the Constitution and legislative and rule of law and all the mythology where we were taught about how this government's legitimate and we agreed to it somehow. And it's sort of a contract that none of us signed. And he just, in the Constitution of No Authority, he just so dismantles and annihilates that for anyone with a 10-year-old ability to use logic. There's just nothing left to believe after that.
What is the most important thing you learned from Albert J. Nock?
Now, at this point, I have to try to remember back to which I read and which things.
You and I spoke before, and you recommended the book Our Enemy, the State.
Yeah. And one of the biggest focuses that I got from him, that he talks about, I forget the terms he uses, but he talks about the two kinds of power. One is persuasive and voluntary, and the other is violent and authoritarian. And he basically breaks down everything into those two things. And when you look at the world that way, you realize government cannot be our friend. It can't be a force for good, because if it were only doing legitimate uses of force, it wouldn't be government anymore. And so he breaks that down. He describes it differently than I do, but I think he did a great job. It's a little book, but he did a great job of, if you just view it as, the just way to interact and the unjust way to interact, it's kind of hard to miss that government's always in the category of the unjust way.
So talking to someone who might say, look, I get you're right on principle, but I am honestly so terrified of a world without some state. I mean, you're not even a minarchist, unbelievably. I'm so terrified of that being a terrible circumstance. I know what there is now. It ain't perfect, but I'm so terrified of the unknown, I'm going to continue advocating statism. How do you respond to that?
I respond usually by saying, like, whatever your concerns and your worries and your predictions of what might happen otherwise, or what you think other people will believe and what they'll go along with or not, do you personally advocate the initiation of violence against me? Because I'm not going to let you off the hook if you say, well, yeah, I do, but that's because I'm not sure what would work otherwise. Now, if you say, I don't know what's going to happen, but I'm not going to advocate that you be robbed, like maybe things will go horribly, I'm not sure it's going to work, maybe it would work better some other way. If you personally aren't advocating violence against me and other people, I'm okay with your predictions. And I may try to comfort you and tell you it's not that bad, it's not that scary. But if you are advocating violence against me, I don't give a crap what your excuses are. If you're advocating that I be robbed because you're not sure how things would work anyway, I'm going to guilt trip the hell out of you and call you out for being an immoral coward, because you are. And the fact that you're not quite sure how things would look if you didn't advocate that I be robbed, that doesn't make it okay. Now, if you predict that other people are going to want me robbed, or government will be around forever, that's fine, as long as you're not the one condoning it. Because if you're condoning it against me, don't give me your BS excuses about why you're condoning evil against me. I don't condone evil against you. I don't want you robbed for anything. I don't want you forced to go along with anything. I don't want violence initiated against you for any reason, even though I don't know what all would happen in a free world, because that's what it's like to have a moral principle, and it would be nice if you'd return the favor.
Tomorrow, your brother enlists in the military or police. What do you say to your brother?
I have to give a confession. I do have a relative. He's not a brother, but a younger relative who did become a cop in one of the local towns here. And he already knows what I think. I've even talked to him before. It would be a little bit different whether it was military or police. If it was either way, I'd say don't do that. It's totally immoral. If it was somebody in the military, I'd probably point him to, one of the dozen or so former Marines I know who are now anarchists, who say, don't ever do that. It's whatever you thought it was going to be. It's 1,000 times worse and way more evil. But I guess if I only had a few seconds to ask somebody, I'd say, while you're doing that job, I want you to keep asking yourself, and do it consciously and repeatedly and specifically, are you doing anything that you know would be immoral for you to do if you didn't have that badge or that uniform? And if you can at all times say, nope, this is all justified, I'm okay with it. And that's not going to happen. You will be told to do things that you know would be immoral if you did them on your own. Don't do immoral things just because somebody else told you to.
But Larken, here I am, a military and police officer. I'm putting my life on the line. I did so with the best intentions. I've done many things in which I've saved lives. I've stopped bad things from happening. Why are you so unappreciative, and you'd rather throw this philosophical thing at me than just thank me for my service?
If all you ever did was use force to defend the innocent against aggressors, I would genuinely thank you, whether you had a badge or not, whether you had a uniform or not. The thing is, if you're a cop or a soldier, that is not all you're doing. First of all, you're being paid with money that was stolen from me and from everybody else. We didn't have a choice. Second of all, your job includes obeying orders that tell you to go commit violence, to go initiate violence. The fact that you may sometimes stop other aggressors doesn't mean it's okay when you are the aggressor, and you are. You can't not be an aggressor and be a law enforcer. A law enforcer enforces the law, including laws against crimes that don't have victims, and laws where you're robbing people and looking for reasons to give people tickets for stupid things where they didn't threaten anybody. I would genuinely thank anybody, even a soldier, if they did something heroic and actually protected the innocent from an aggressor. But you can't be a cop or a soldier without also being an aggressor. It's like saying, hey, I'm a carjacker, but last night I helped a little old lady across the street. Good for you. Stop being a carjacker.
All right. So, last question I want to throw at you here. A very important aspect to becoming free is being able to simply see through. It's not necessarily going in, ending the Federal Reserve, taking Bernanke out in handcuffs or whoever's in now. It's more the thought process about being able to see through lies, to see through immorality, to see through propaganda. If I'm someone who wants to not only physically be free in my exchanges, but I also want to think free, what are some ways that I could train myself to see through propaganda? And what are some propaganda methods that I should be aware of?
Well, it brings to mind a weird thing I heard about Confucius, of all things, where somebody asked, if you were put in charge of the civil government, what's the first thing you would do? And his response, purportedly, was, I would give things their proper names, which, first time I heard it, I was like, what? Like, all the things you could do, you do that? One of the best exercises is whenever you hear something on the news or from political party or candidate or politician or whatever, literally describe what they just used euphemisms to describe. What actually happens? If you're talking about, we all contribute to the, all right, what are you really talking about? If it's taxation, what does we all contribute look like? Does it look like every April 15th, millions of people fill out a confusing form and hand over money because they're scared out of their gourd of being thrown in a cage if they don't? Put those words in place of we all contribute. Okay, we all fill out complicated forms because we're scared of getting put in a cage to help our neighbor. Okay, it's not to help our, it's so that some of the money, after the huge bureaucracy wastes most of it, gets given to people who filled out forms asking politicians for handouts, some of whom may be liars and crooks, some may actually need it. A lot of the people who may need it, and maybe decent people, didn't bother to go through the process, so they're not getting it anyway. And suddenly the pleasant sounding little line of politicians is there's lots of violence and then some corruption and maybe a little bit of good happens at the other end, but not for the people who need it most. And when you break it down to just the literal reality, all the things that people feel good, and that's, you know, the example of welfare. You can do the same thing with the military. I'm fighting for your freedom. All right, literally, what are you doing? Well, I'm walking around with a machine gun in poppy fields. And poppy plants weren't a threat to my freedom. So why, and why are you doing that? And who's paying you? And where did the money come from? Just literally describing what's actually going on breaks through so much of the propaganda, because almost everything politicians say is vague euphemism and BS. Because if they literally describe their actual policies, everybody would go, ew, I don't want that. So just be accurate. Start by being accurate in your own head of what you're actually condoning and advocating and what we're talking about in literally accurate terms, instead of this fluffy nonsense that most people
So we got about 1 minute left. I got one more question for you. Noam Chomsky finally responded to one of my emails. I asked him what his opposition was to taking the principles of free market, voluntary interaction, not necessarily money, banking, business, and all this other stuff he's criticized, just taking what my criteria is for freedom. Voluntary exchange, original appropriation, holding up your promises through contract, no fraud. And I said, what is so wrong about that, Mr. Chomsky? To which this PhD guy responds, well, just look at history. I think I'm going to make this email public. He goes, well, all you have to do is look at history and look at the corruption that happens in the absence of state involvement. Ideally, once humanity progresses, we could have anarcho-syndicalism. Until then, gosh, you really just can't handle it. Main point, just look at history, which is this perfectly vague, no real response that I got. Larken, looking at history, what is the most important example for someone to learn?
The belief in authority causes hundreds of millions of people to be oppressed and robbed and extorted and murdered. And if you don't notice that when reading a history book, you have your eyes closed. The idea that you can read history and go, good thing we had authority around, that's beyond delusional.
Larken, thank you so much for your time. I want to get this book in there one more time. Parasites on Parade again. Give me a really good anarchist, a voluntarist, libertarian quote at the bottom. I'll send you a free book. Larken can verify I have him. He signed them for me when he was in Arizona. Larken, thank you so much for taking the time today.
Thank you. It's been fun.